Experiments on citizens that history forgot. Imagine living in a country that promises freedom, justice, and protection, only to discover that, behind closed doors, your own government might have been using you as a test subject. For decades, the United States carried out secret experiments on unsuspecting citizens, often in the name of science or national security. These weren't small mistakes. These were deliberate, carefully planned projects that left lasting scars on people's lives. Most Americans have never heard of them, because many were buried deep in classified files until whistleblowers and journalists dragged them into the light. And today, we're pulling back the curtain on the forgotten experiments the US government doesn't want you to remember. Let's start with one of the most infamous, Project MKUltra. In the early 1950s, as the Cold War was heating up, the CIA became obsessed with mind control. They feared that Soviet agents could brainwash prisoners of war, and they wanted to fight fire with fire. The solution? Experiment on their own people. MKUltra was a sprawling program that lasted for over a decade. The CIA secretly dosed unsuspecting individuals with LSD, hallucinogens, and other chemicals, sometimes in bars, sometimes in safe houses, and even in hospitals. Ordinary citizens, military personnel, prisoners, and psychiatric patients were used as guinea pigs, usually without their consent. One of the most disturbing cases involved Dr. Frank Olson, a US Army scientist who was secretly given LSD by his CIA colleagues. Days later, Olson plunged to his death from a New York City hotel window. Officially, his death was called a suicide. But decades later, declassified files suggested something far darker, that Olson had been silenced because he knew too much about MKUltra. The scope of MKUltra was staggering. Researchers tried hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and even electroshock therapy, all to figure out how to break down and control the human mind. By the time the program was exposed in the 1970s, thousands of people had been affected. But here's the shocking part. The CIA destroyed most of the records, meaning we may never know just how many lives were ruined in the name of national security. And that's just the beginning. Because if MKUltra sounds disturbing, the next case shows how the government was willing to let entire communities suffer, just to gather data. Tuskegee Syphilis Study. If MKUltra was about breaking minds, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study was about breaking trust. And to this day, it remains one of the most shameful chapters in American medical history. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service launched what they called the Tuskegee Study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. The study took place in Macon County, Alabama, one of the poorest regions in the South. The government recruited 600 black men, 399 who already had syphilis, and 201 who did not. These men were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local term that covered a variety of illnesses. They were promised free medical exams, hot meals, and even burial insurance. But here's the horrifying truth: they were never actually treated. The real purpose of the study was to observe what happened to the human body when syphilis went untreated, even though effective treatments already existed. At the beginning of the study, there wasn't a reliable cure. But by the 1940s, penicillin was discovered to be an effective treatment for syphilis. Doctors across the country were curing patients. Yet the men in Tuskegee were deliberately denied treatment, even as they grew sicker, suffered debilitating symptoms, and died. For 40 years, the US government let these men suffer in silence. Many passed the disease on to their wives and children, creating generations of pain. The study only came to light in 1972, when a whistleblower leaked the story to the press. The public was outraged. Congressional hearings followed, and the study was finally shut down. By then, more than 100 men had died directly from syphilis or related complications. Dozens of wives were infected. At least 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. In 1997, a full 65 years after the study began, President Bill Clinton formally apologized on behalf of the United States government. In his speech, he admitted, the United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. Survivors of the study, sitting in the White House that day, nodded silently. For them, the apology came too late. The Tuskegee study didn't just ruin lives, it shattered trust. To this day, many African Americans cite Tuskegee as a reason for their mistrust of government health programs and medical research. It wasn't just about syphilis. It was about how human beings were used as disposable data points, with no regard for their dignity or their lives. If that makes your blood boil, wait until you hear what happened next, when the US military sprayed chemicals and bacteria directly into American neighborhoods, just to see what would happen. Operation Sea Spray and AMP, biological tests on American cities. Imagine waking up in your city one morning, breathing the fresh coastal air, completely unaware that the government had secretly sprayed bacteria into the atmosphere to see how it spread. That's not a science fiction story, it really happened in the United States. In 1950, the US Navy carried out a secret operation called Operation Sea Spray in San Francisco. Naval ships off the coast sprayed a cloud of two bacteria, Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii, over the city. The goal? To test how vulnerable a major urban center would be to a biological attack. San Francisco's 500,000 residents had no idea they were being used as test subjects. Soon after, hospitals reported unusual outbreaks of infections. One man, Edward Nevin, died after contracting a rare infection linked to the bacteria that had been sprayed. For years, the government denied any connection, but documents later revealed that the test was deliberate. And San Francisco wasn't the only city. Between the 1940s and 1960s, the US military conducted hundreds of secret biological tests in places like New York City, Washington, D.C., Minneapolis, and St. Louis. Sometimes they released harmless particles from airplanes, rooftops, or even light bulbs in subways to study how far they would spread. In St. Louis, zinc cadmium sulfide, a compound now considered potentially toxic, was sprayed over poor neighborhoods. Residents were told it was smoke testing for the military. They weren't told that it could be dangerous. For decades, families in those neighborhoods reported higher than average cancer rates. Many believe the secret experiments contributed to those illnesses, though the government has never fully admitted responsibility. The scariest part? The military wasn't just testing how particles moved. They wanted to know how vulnerable Americans would be in the event of a real biological attack. In other words, everyday citizens, men, women, children, became human test subjects without their knowledge or consent. When journalists finally exposed these experiments in the 1970s, public outrage was explosive. Congressional hearings revealed that the US Army had conducted at least 239 secret biological warfare tests in cities across America. Officials claimed the bacteria and chemicals used were harmless, but the truth was murkier. And by the time people found out, it was impossible to trace the long-term health effects. Think about that for a second. You could be walking through your neighborhood, sending your kids to school, going to work, and above your head, the government was testing how best to spread germs in the air. It sounds like a plot from a dystopian movie. But for thousands of unsuspecting Americans, it was reality. And as shocking as spraying bacteria over entire cities might sound, it wasn't the only time the US experimented with radiation and fallout on innocent people. Which brings us to our next chilling story, the secret tests on nuclear fallout victims in the Pacific. Project 4.1 and AMP, nuclear testing on Marshall Islanders. By the 1950s, the United States was locked in a race to perfect nuclear weapons. To do that, the military needed a testing ground, and they chose the Marshall Islands, a remote group of islands in the Pacific Ocean. What the local population didn't know was that they weren't just bystanders to these tests. They would become part of the experiment. In 1954, the US detonated one of the most powerful nuclear bombs ever tested, the Castle Bravo hydrogen bomb, at Bikini Atoll. It was more than 1,000 times stronger than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The explosion was so massive that it created a blinding flash, a mushroom cloud that stretched into the stratosphere, and a radioactive fallout that drifted for miles. Nearby, the residents of Ronglap and Utrik atolls, small island communities living off fishing and farming, suddenly saw white ash falling from the sky. Children played in it, thinking it was snow. Adults washed their hair in it. They had no idea the ash was radioactive fallout from the detonation. Soon, people began vomiting, developing burns on their skin, and losing their hair. Livestock died. Crops withered. Entire communities were poisoned. Instead of rushing to provide medical aid, the US military launched Project 4.1, a study to observe the effects of radiation on human beings. Doctors and scientists monitored the islanders' health over time, documenting the effects of radiation exposure. The people thought they were receiving treatment, but in reality, they were being studied like lab rats. Over the years, residents suffered from cancers, birth defects, and chronic illnesses. Women experienced miscarriages and gave birth to babies with severe deformities. Families who had lived peacefully for generations suddenly found themselves living in a nightmare created by a bomb they never asked for. Even US servicemen were caught up in the fallout. Some were ordered to sail through radioactive waters to study contamination levels. Many later developed health problems. But the Marshall Islanders, isolated and without power, bore the brunt of the damage. It wasn't until decades later that survivors began speaking out. They described children born with no bones, jelly-like masses they called jellyfish babies. They told stories of lifelong health problems and the loss of their ancestral lands, which were rendered uninhabitable by radiation. In 1995, the US government finally admitted that the Marshall Islanders had been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. But by then, the damage had already been done. Generations were scarred, and many continue to suffer today. What makes Project 4.1 so chilling is not just the physical toll, but the moral one. These were human beings, entire communities, used as test subjects in one of the most dangerous scientific experiments ever carried out. And the fallout, both literal and figurative, is still being felt today. But America's experiments weren't always about bombs and bacteria. Sometimes, they were about something as simple and cruel as words. That's what brings us to our final story, the infamous monster study. The monster study, when words became weapons. Not all secret experiments involved radiation, chemicals, or biological weapons. Sometimes, the weapon was far simpler, language itself. In 1939, in Davenport, Iowa, a psychologist named Wendell Johnson wanted to test a theory. He believed stuttering wasn't a biological disorder, but something that could be taught through negative feedback. To prove it, he launched an experiment that would later be remembered as the monster study. Johnson and his graduate student, Mary Tudor, went to the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home, where vulnerable children were living without parents during the Great Depression. These kids trusted their caretakers, but what they didn't know was that they were about to become test subjects in a psychological experiment that would scar them for life. 22 children were divided into groups. Some of them actually had stutters. Others spoke normally. The researchers then carried out two very different approaches. One group of children was given positive reinforcement. They were praised for speaking well and encouraged to express themselves freely. The other group, the unlucky ones, were constantly criticized for every minor speech mistake. Even normal hesitations were called out as signs of a stutter. They were told something was wrong with them. They were told they shouldn't speak unless they could do it perfectly. Imagine being a child, already vulnerable, and suddenly every word you say is met with correction, shame, and ridicule. Over time, the pressure broke him down. Children who had spoken normally began to stutter. Others became withdrawn, terrified of speaking at all. They carried that psychological damage well into adulthood. The researchers never told the children what had been done to them. The kids were left to deal with the shame, the self-doubt, and the speech problems that the experiment had planted in their minds. Decades later, when the truth finally came out, many of the subjects were still struggling with anxiety, depression, and speech disorders. It was called the Monster Study, not at the time, but later, because even other psychologists were horrified at the cruelty of experimenting on innocent orphans this way. Unlike Project MK Ultra or the Tuskegee Study, this wasn't about controlling minds or testing drugs. This was about proving a theory, at the cost of children's lives and futures. And that's the thread that runs through all of these hidden chapters of US history: real human beings, men, women, children, treated as disposable. Stripped of their dignity, their health, even their futures, all in the name of science and progress. Today, these stories stand as a warning. They remind us how easily the pursuit of knowledge can cross into cruelty. They force us to ask hard questions. How many more experiments have we not been told about? How many truths are still buried? What we do know is this: the victims of these experiments can't be forgotten. Their suffering should not be hidden in the footnotes of history. Because the moment we forget, that's the moment we risk repeating the same mistakes again.